The flight was going smoothly until a flight attendant stopped in front of a young boy in first class and asked, "Where's your guardian? This seat isn't for you." The boy clenched his small hands around his stuffed airplane, and before he could say anything, the flight attendant grabbed his arm and pushed him back into his seat. Other passengers looked over but quickly turned away. No one said anything or helped him. She thought he was just another kid in the wrong place. She had no idea that the only owner of the whole airline was listening. She wouldn't just lose her job when the plane landed, she would lose everything. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you are watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe for more. The quiet hum of the airplane filled the cabin as people settled into their seats. One of them was a little boy named Zen, whose legs were slightly above the floor as he adjusted himself in the plush first-class chair while holding a worn-out stuffed airplane tightly to his chest. He was twitching his fingers as he tried to calm down. Flying always made him nervous, not because he was afraid of the plane itself, but because it was so uncomfortable for him. His muscles would stiffen up when he sat for too long, and changing positions took more work than most people thought. But he was excited. It was his first time flying alone, and his father had told him everything would be fine. He just had to sit quietly, follow the rules, and enjoy the ride. Zen reached for his seat belt, fumbling a bit as he did so. He tried to buckle it, but his fingers weren't moving fast enough. Anger built in his chest, and his body hurt from how stiff it was. He let out a small, frustrated whimper, and as soon as it ended, a shadow appeared over him. It was a tall woman in a clean uniform standing next to his seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her sharp eyes spanned him from head to toe, and her lips were pressed together in a thin line. Miss Calloway had been a flight attendant for years, and she was proud of how well-behaved she was. In her mind, this boy did not belong. "You need to sit still," Miss Calloway said in a rushed and irritated voice. She looked at the stuffed airplane he was holding and told him to put it away because first-class passengers don't carry toys around like that. Zen's fingers curled around the airplane to protect it, and he looked up at her with his lips slightly parted as if he wanted to say something but his words didn't come fast enough. This was something he had always had trouble with. He could only talk when he was calm, but right now, under her sharp gaze, it felt impossible. His chest tightened and his breathing sped up. Miss Calloway sighed and rolled her eyes as she reached down, grabbed his arm, and pushed him back against the seat. "Sit still," she said over and over in a cold, angry tone. Zen gasped softly, his body tensing from the sudden force. A few people looked over, their eyes moving between the child and the flight attendant. Some looked uncomfortable, but others quickly went back to their books or screens to act like they hadn't seen anything, while others just ignored it because they were too focused on their own comfort to care. Tears filled Zen's eyes, and he sank into his seat, his breathing becoming uneven. He wanted to tell her that he was trying, that his legs hurt, and that he wasn't trying to make a scene, but the words were stuck in his throat like a knot he couldn't untie. His fingers shook as he reached for his tablet, and the screen lit up when he tapped the voice message icon, just like his father had told him to. He was told that if something went wrong, he should send a message. He did, and his voice was soft and shaky. "Daddy, the lady hurt my arm. She said I can't be here, I want to go home." He pressed send, and his hands shook as he put the tablet back on his chest. He was shaking not just from fear, but also from a deeper feeling of being unwanted, of being seen as a problem instead of a person. Miss Calloway stood back up and pressed her uniform as if nothing had happened. This was just another moment of keeping. She didn't know that the voice message had already been delivered or that everything was about to change in just a few minutes. Zen stared at the tablet screen as the message status changed to delivered. His hands were still shaking from where Miss Calloway had grabbed him, and he blinked quickly to try to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall. He didn't want to cry here, in front of all these strangers, but his chest hurt, and no matter how hard he tried to steady himself, he couldn't. The lump in his throat wouldn't go away, but Miss Calloway had already moved on. She walked down the aisle and fixed her uniform as if nothing had happened. For her, this was just another moment of keeping order in her section. A child crying was just an inconvenience, She had seen parents let their kids run around and disturb the peace of first class. Zen was no different. If he couldn't behave, he shouldn't be at the front of the plane, according to Mirror, another flight attendant. While watching, Mirror felt uneasy because she had seen everything, how Miss Calloway grabbed the boy and how his small body tensed up in fear. She had only been a flight attendant for a year, but she already knew how things worked and knew it wouldn't be easy to speak out against a senior attendant like Miss Calloway. She stepped closer to Miss Calloway near the drink card and lowered her voice. Was that really necessary? Miss Calloway barely glanced at her, and she laughed at the boy. I frowned and said, he's just a kid. Did you see his hands? I think he has trouble moving them properly. Miss Calloway sighed impatiently and said, then he shouldn't be flying alone in first class. She grabbed a bottle of sparkling water from the cart and turned away. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if someone gave him that seat as a free upgrade. I'll check the system later. Mariera opened her mouth to say something else, but she stopped herself because she was pushing too hard wood. Miss Calloway became more defensive, so she looked back at Zen, who was curled up in his seat with his head lowered and his stuffed airplane still tightly gripped in his hands. She didn't know what to do, but something about this felt wrong. Meanwhile, Elias Carter was finishing up a business call miles away in his private office when his phone vibrated on the desk. He looked at the screen and his heart skipped a beat when he saw it was from Zen. Zen rarely called or sent messages while traveling, so Elias swiping to play the voice note as soon as he saw it. His whole body stiffened as he said, Daddy, the woman hurt my arm. She said I can't be here, I want to go home. The office was silent. Elias clenched his jaw as he played the message again, making sure he had heard it correctly. He could tell Zen had been crying because he could hear the slight tremor in his voice as he struggled to get the words out. Elias let out a sharp exhale and pressed a button on his office phone. Within seconds, Cole answered, Yes, sir. Elias's voice was calm, but that tone was definitely sharp. I need flight information for Zen's trip right now. There was a short pause before Cole replied, checking now, sir. Elias tapped his fingers on the desk, his mind racing. Someone had hit his son, someone had shoved him, and that person didn't know whose child they had just abused. Elias sat perfectly still, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the polished surface of his desk. His face was blank, but underneath his calm exterior was. He wasn't easily angry, but when it came to his son, there were no second chances. Suddenly, a soft chime from his phone interrupted his thoughts. There was a new email, Flight 237 First Class Passenger Manifest. He opened it right away and started reading through the list of names. His eyes immediately fell on one senior flight attendant's name, Calloway Maird. He remembered it in an instant before reaching for his phone again and telling Cole, Get me in. Yes, Sir Cole quickly replied, I'll have him on the line in 5 minutes. Ellis then ended the call and slowly let out a breath, his fingers tightening around the phone. This wasn't just about a rude flight attendant. His son had been shoved by someone who was supposed to make sure his safety, and Zen had been made to feel like he didn't belong in a place where he had every right to be. He leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He already knew what was going to happen next. It's likely that the flight attendant would try to play down the situation. She would say that Zen was just restless and maybe even disruptive. Elias had seen this happen before with his son. As soon as people saw him, they thought he was difficult because he moved differently, and they thought he wasn't supposed to be in first class because they didn't think a disabled child should be there. But this time, those assumptions were going to cost someone their job. On Flight 237, Miss Calloway moved through the first-class cabin, checking on passengers as if nothing had happened. When she saw that Zaylin had finally stopped talking, she smiled happily. In her career, she had dealt with many rude, demanding, and spoiled passengers who thought they were more important than they really were. She didn't like them, and she wasn't going to treat this boy like he was royalty. From the galley, Mara stole another look at the boy. He hadn't moved much since she last saw him. While he was sending his message, his little hands were still curled around his stuffed airplane, and his body was tense. Something about it didn't sit right with her, so she walked up to him and knelt down next to him. "Hey," she said softly, "are you okay?" Zen hesitated before looking up. His eyes were red, and his breathing was still irregular. He didn't say anything, but he did shake his head a little. "Did Calloway hurt your arm?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. Mira felt a lump form in her throat. She knew the answer, but hearing it from him made her stomach twist. "Do you need anything?" she asked in a soft voice. Zen hesitated again, and after a long pause, he whispered, "I want my dad." Mira nodded, her chest tightening as she said, "Okay." She stood up and walked toward the front of the plane, her mind racing. She couldn't keep quiet about this, and she didn't know it yet, but the choice she was about to make would change everything. She had never questioned a senior flight attendant before, but this was different. This wasn't about a passenger complaining about the wrong meal or an uncomfortable seat. This was about a disabled child being abused by someone who was supposed to protect him. She found Miss Calloway pouring coffee from the beverage cart as if nothing had happened. Mira hesitated for half a second before asking, "Miss Calloway, may I speak with you for a moment?" Miss Calloway barely spoke. The older woman finally looked up, her brows knit together in irritation. "What about him?" Mira asked, knowing there was no easy way to say it. "He's upset. He says you hurt his arm." Miss Calloway laughed. "Oh, please? I barely touched him." She put her cup down and crossed her arms. "He was fidgeting, and I did what any professional would do. I corrected his behavior." Myra's jaw tightened. "He was grabbed by Miss Calloway and is now sitting there holding his stuffed airplane like he's afraid to move." "He should sit still," Miss Calloway snapped. "Do you know how many high-paying customers we have in first class? No one wants to listen to a whining child for an entire flight." "If he can't handle it, he shouldn't be here," she said. "He can't help it." Myra's stomach turned. "He can't help it," she said. "Did you even look at him?" Miss Calloway warned Mira to watch her tone, but Mira wouldn't back down. "What if someone did that to your child?" she asked. "Would you be so dismissive then?" For the first time, Miss Calloway hesitated. A brief flash of guilt might have crossed her face, but it went away just as quickly. She straightened her uniform and took a sip of her coffee. "It's done. The boy's quiet now, isn't he?" Mira stared at her, shocked. She had been hoping and even expecting Miss Calloway to at least say something. At least act like she cared, but there was no regret, no second thoughts, just cold indifference. Mira clenched her fists. She had tried to reason with her, but now she had to do something else before she could move. The intercom screamed, "Miss Calloway, please report to the cockpit immediately." Miss Calloway frowned and looked at Mira before sharply exhaling. "Stay out of this," she muttered as she brushed past her on her way to the cockpit. Mira didn't move right away. She stared at the back of Miss Calloway's uniform. As she walked away, her mind was racing with something happening, and whatever it was, Miss Calloway had no idea how bad things were about to get. She hurried toward the cockpit, adjusting her uniform as she went. She didn't know why she was being called, but the harsh tone in the captain's voice made her uneasy. She was used to being in charge of everything, but something about this felt different. When she got there, she saw Captain Hughes standing near the control panel, his face expressionless. The co-pilot next to him barely spared her a glance as he watched the flight. But what made her stomach tighten was the voice on the in-flight phone panel. It was deep and powerful. "Is she there?" the voice asked. Captain Hughes nodded once, but the person on the other end couldn't see. "Yes, sir, Senior Attendant Calloway is here," Miss Calloway said. "Who is this?" the captain asked. "This is Elias Carter." The name made her heart race. Elias Carter was the founder and owner of Aerosky Airlines, the airline she worked for. He had built the company from the ground up and had full control over everyone, from executives to flight attendants like her. Most importantly, he was Zen's father. For the first time, she felt something shift in her chest. "I'd like an explanation," Elias said in a steady but sharp voice. Miss Calloway opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't know what to say. Had already been reported or how much he knew about it. Captain Hughes crossed his arms and asked, "Would you like to explain why a first-class passenger, a child, was physically handled by a member of my crew?" Miss Calloway stiffened. "Captain, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The boy was being disruptive, and I simply corrected his behavior." "I never meant to shove him," Elias said. "My son, a disabled child." Miss Calloway's mouth went dry. Eliada heard his voice and continued, "He told me what you did." "You think I'm going to let this slide?" Elias asked coldly. She forced a small, tight smile. "Sir. I assure you it was nothing serious. He was fidgeting a lot, and I only decided he didn't belong. You only humiliated him in front of other passengers. You only grabbed his arm and forced him back into his seat like he was a problem instead of a person," she replied. "I promise you that this will be handled properly." Miss Calloway looked at the captain and said, "Wait, we're moved." The captain's face darkened as he said, "You thought you could put your hands on a child and just keep working like nothing happened." He shook his head and said, "That's not how this works." Elias spoke again, this time with a calm voice, "This conversation is far from over." Miss Calloway would go back to her son right away and apologize to him personally. When the plane lands, she would be escorted for. When the airline board asked Miss Calloway to leave, her heart was racing because things were getting worse too quickly. The line went dead, and the captain's glare stayed firm, "Get out of there now." Miss Calloway turned her legs and felt heavy as she stepped out of the cockpit. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her, but it wasn't just about Zen anymore. She had to answer to the man who owned the sky she was flying in. As she stepped out of the cockpit, her palms felt cold. She wasn't in charge of moving through the cabin for the first time in her career. As she made her way back down the aisle, each step felt heavier than the last. Passengers were too focused on their movies, meals, or conversations to notice her. They had no idea that her whole career was falling apart before the plane even took off. As she got closer to first class, she looked at Zen, who was still curled up in his seat with a stuffed airplane against his chest. His eyes were red. He hadn't moved much since she last saw him, but something about his expression made her feel guilty for the first time. She had told herself that she was just doing her job and that keeping order in first class was more important than a child who was acting up, but when she looked at him now and saw how small and quiet he had become, she felt something sink deep into her chest. Marrera stood a few rows away and watched the scene play out. The tension in the air was palpable. Mara crossed her arms and waited to see what Miss Calloway would do. When she got to Zen's seat, she cleared her throat. The boy flinched slightly at the sound of her voice but didn't look up. She swallowed hard and said, "There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your seat properly." Zen finally turned to face her, but Miss Calloway couldn't read her face. She wasn't used to being questioned or held responsible. She was always the one who made the rules. The situation, but now, for the first time, she didn't have control over it. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, forcing the words out. Zen blinked at her, his lips parted slightly as if he wanted to say something, but then he tilted his head and said, "You're saying it was a miscommunication?" His voice was small but steady, and Miss Calloway nodded stiffly. "Yes, there was." She hesitated, looking for the right words to say, "A mistaken judgment." Zen frowned slightly. "You saw my ticket," he said quietly, "and you still told me to move." A few people nearby shifted in. They had been sitting still before, but now they were looking at the conversation. Miss Calloway's skin pricked. "I might have misjudged the situation." Zen didn't look happy. He studied her, his small fingers tightening around his stuffed airplane. Then, without looking away, he reached for his tablet and tapped the screen. A few seconds later, a new voice message was sent. "Daddy, she wants me to go back." "What should I do?" The message was sent right away, and Miss Calloway's stomach dropped. She wasn't in charge of making the decision. It was up to the man to decide if she would ever work in the skies again. Zen put the tablet back on his lap and waited for a response. The quiet ding of the message being sent sounded like a warning bell in Miss Calloway's ears. She felt a tightness in her chest and the weight of what was happening pressed down on her more than before. People nearby looked at each other, their interest growing as they saw how Miss Calloway had spoken to Zen earlier. They had seen her slam the door in his face and treat him like he didn't belong, and now they were seeing her stand there stiff and uneasy as she realized she wasn't in charge anymore. Zen stared at his tablet in silence, waiting for the screen to light up with a new voice message from Daddy. He tapped it right away, and the deep, firm voice of Elias Carter filled the space. "Take your time and make her understand what she did," Jen said. Jen slowly looked up at her, his eyes steady. He wasn't crying, shaking, or shrinking away like he did before. He had power now. Miss Calloway forced a polite, tight-lipped smile and said, "Come on, let's get you back to your seat." She said this to try to get past the awkwardness of the situation. "We don't want to. Why did you think I didn't belong here?" Zen interrupted, his voice soft but clear. Miss Calloway froze. People turned their heads and paid attention. Even Marrera, who had been quietly watching from a distance, held her breath. Zen sat up straighter in his seat. Airplane still in one hand, he continued, "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, just me." Miss Calloway's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The silence was suffocating. Mara moved a little as she watched Miss Calloway's face. For years, the senior flight attendant had carried herself with unwavering confidence, but now, in front of a small boy in a cabin full of passengers, she looked trapped. Zen tilted his head. "If you're going to say sorry, you should at least tell the truth, Miss Calloway." Calloway's throat got tight. She wanted to brush this off, act like it wasn't a big deal, but Zen wouldn't let her. Now that everyone was looking at her, she had to do something she had never done before. She had to answer. Zen's words weighed heavier on Miss Calloway than anything she had ever felt before. The boy wasn't mad, he wasn't raising his voice or demanding anything. He had just asked a question that she didn't want to answer. Her mouth felt dry as she struggled to come up with an answer. Coming up with something to say, the usual responses and excuses she had used before, wouldn't work now. Not with people listening, not with the airline owner on the other end of that tablet waiting to see how this would go. Miss Calloway cleared her throat. She started to say something, but the words died before they could form. Zen's eyes didn't leave her. He had been small and quiet just minutes before, but now he wasn't scared. He wasn't looking away to be ignored. He was waiting for the truth. The first-class cabin used to be full of casual conversations, but now there was only the sound of silverware clinking. Passengers who had chosen to remain silent earlier were no longer acting like they didn't care. They were actually listening. Marrera crossed her arms and carefully watched Miss Calloway. She had never seen her hesitate like this before. Miss Calloway had always carried herself with a strict sense of authority, but now she looked quartered. Zen's fingers curled around a stuffed airplane on his lap. His voice was steady but had a quiet strength to it. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket," he repeated, "just me." Miss Calloway let out a sharp breath through her nose, her jaw tightening. "I didn't mean to offend you," she said, her tone stiff. "I just thought there was a mistake." Zen blinked slowly, realizing that whatever she said now would either make her look stupid or reveal the truth she wasn't ready to face because he was a child. Because he was disabled, she thought he had been put in first class by mistake. She had never asked the well-dressed businessman in the first row or the older woman sipping champagne about her ticket. She had just walked past them all without giving them a second look. But then, as soon as she saw him with his small frame, nervous shifting, and quiet whimpers, she made a choice that would destroy her. Zen's voice broke through her thoughts again. "You looked at me and thought I didn't belong." The longer she stood there in silence, the less she could say. Miss Calloway opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The silence was deafening. Maya's eyes flickered between them, and for a moment she almost felt sorry for Miss Calloway. This wasn't just about an apology anymore, it was about responsibility. Zen slowly sat up straighter. "If you're sorry," he said softly, "then say what you did." Miss Calloway swallowed hard, her hands clenching at her sides. She hesitated again, but there was nowhere to hide. As things got worse, people were waiting. Maya was waiting. Elias Carter, the man who could end her career with one phone call, was definitely waiting. Finally, Miss Calloway forced herself to speak. "I misjudged you," she said, her voice lowered. "I looked at you and I thought you weren't supposed to be here." Maya's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. She hadn't expected the truth. Zen carefully studied Miss Calloway. His finger was still gripping his stuffed airplane, but his shoulders were dazed. He said in a soft but firm voice, "You thought I wasn't supposed to be here, but I was." Miss Calloway stiffly nodded, swallowing her pride. "Yes," Zen said with a slight tilt of his head. "Then why did you push me?" Miss Calloway's throat tightened. The words hung between them heavy and unshakable. Passengers leaned in slightly to wait. No one spoke or moved. Miss Calloway's fingers twitched at her sides. She wanted to say that she hadn't really pushed him and that it wasn't that bad, that he was exaggerating, but she knew she couldn't. She had shoved him, grabbed his arm, and forced him back into his seat. She had seen him struggling and treated him like an inconvenience, and now she had to admit it. Mira watched closely, wondering what Miss Calloway would do next. Miss Calloway took a sharp breath and said, "I should not have done that." Her voice was strained as she said, "I was impatient and I was wrong." Zen's expression stayed blank for a long time before giving her a small nod of approval. Miss Calloway's eyebrows furrowed slightly. Zen adjusted the stuffed airplane in his hands and said, "Okay, now you know." Miss Calloway blinked. She was expecting anger or maybe even more questions, but Zen took her words not as an apology but as an acknowledgement of what she had done. Other passengers looked at each other and nodded subtly, as if agreeing that the boy had won the conversation without having to speak up. Miss Calloway felt strange because for years she had been the one controlling the other passengers, but now a small boy, a child, she had brushed them off as nothing. Without a second thought, he had just made her face something she had never questioned before, and that was worse than any punishment she could have imagined. Marera finally broke the silence by saying, "I think that's enough." She used a neutral but firm tone to say this, "Let's get Zen back to his seat." Zen hesitated, then nodded, and slowly stood up. He was careful and deliberate in his movements because of what had happened earlier, and he still didn't fully trust his legs. Mara gently put her hand on his shoulder and pushed him forward. As Zen walked past, he stopped and looked up at her one last time. "Next time," he said softly, "don't just see what you expect to see." And then he walked away, leaving Miss Calloway standing there feeling smaller than she ever had before. Miss Calloway stood frozen in the aisle as Zen walked past her, led gently by Mara. The weight of his words settled deep in her chest, heavier than she expected. "Next time, don't just see what you expect to see," kept playing over and over in her mind like an echo she couldn't turn off. Even though it was something simple, what he said meant more to her than anything she had heard in years. Her career was built on being able to read people and figure out who belonged where. But today, a child, a disabled boy who should have been easy to dismiss, had shattered that illusion with nothing more than quiet strength and a refusal to accept anything less than the truth. As Zen went back to his seat, some people shook their heads in disapproval while others gave him quiet nods of respect. For the first time in a long time, Miss Calloway felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: shame. She had spent years believing she was always right and that her judgment was always sound, but now that she was standing in front of people who had just seen her being questioned and not being able to defend herself, she felt completely exposed. Mara helped Zane settle back into his first-class seat, adjusting his blanket and making sure he was comfortable as she spoke softly to him and offered him juice and a snack. Like Miss Calloway should have from the start, Zen took the juice but didn't drink it right away. Instead, he picked up his tablet again and carefully typed a short message that said, "Daddy, I'm back in my seat." Miss Calloway swallowed hard. She didn't know what Elias Carter would do next, but she did know that her job at this airline was in danger. She turned to go to the galley to hide before anyone could say anything else, but just as she did, taking a step back, the intercom went off above them. "Ladies and gentlemen," it said, "this is Captain Hughes speaking." It was an urgent message from airline headquarters, and all crew members were asked to stay at their stations while we prepared for landing. Thank you, Miss Calloway. Passengers looked at each other in confusion. That wasn't a normal announcement, Mare said, turning her head slightly toward the galley. That's weird, Miss Calloway thought. She knew what that announcement meant. This wasn't just a normal announcement. As if to confirm her fears, the in-flight phone near the front of the cabin buzzed sharply. Both Mira and Miss Calloway turned to look at it, and another flight attendant, Jonas, picked it up. This is flight crew, he said cautiously. He was quiet for a moment as he listened, and then his eyes flickered to Miss Calloway, changing his expression to something she couldn't quite read. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke, Yes, sir. Miss Calloway's fingers clenched at her. Jonas hesitated, put the phone down, and turned to face her directly. You're to report to the airport security team as soon as we land, she said. There was a heavy pause between them, and Miss Calloway tried to keep her voice steady. Security, she repeated. Jonas didn't look at her with sympathy, he just nodded and said, You're being escorted off the plane. Miss Calloway's breath came faster, and her mind was racing with 100 thoughts, each one worse than the last time she was escorted off the plane by security personnel. Some people were still whispering, but others had stopped because they knew something important was going on. Mara slowly let out a breath and shook her head. I told you, she said under her breath, but not in a mean way. Miss Calloway's hands felt icy cold. This wasn't just a punishment or a warning, it was serious. She looked at Zim, who was leaning back in his seat and staring out the window. His fingers traced empty patterns on his stuffed airplane, but he hadn't gloated, smiled, or celebrated. She took a deep breath and turned back toward the galley. If she wanted to keep her job, she had to think quickly, but no matter how she tried to spin it, she knew one thing for sure, she had already lost Miss Calloway. She stood there, frozen, her breath shallow as the reality of what was happening set in. The whispers in the cabin grew louder, a murmur of curiosity and judgment spreading like wildfire among the passengers she had spent years maintaining. Authorities on flights made sure she was in charge, but now that power had been taken away, passengers who had been ignoring the incident were now paying full attention. Some stole glances at her, while others stared blankly, trying to figure out what had just happened. Some were already typing on their phones, probably texting family or coworkers about the drama happening in the air. This wasn't just a small mistake, it was becoming a scandal. Mara watched Miss Calloway carefully, studying the way her shoulders were slouched. Tensed up and her hands twitched slightly at her sides. She had seen the senior flight attendant handle tough situations before, but this was different. Miss Calloway wasn't in charge anymore, and she knew it. Miss Calloway forced herself to stand taller and smooth her uniform with stiff hands. This is ridiculous, she whispered under her breath, though her voice lacked the confidence it usually had. What is it? Mary Ari raised an eyebrow. Miss Calloway gave her a sharp look but didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention to Jonas. Jonathan didn't flinch under her glare. Straight from headquarters, he said, Elias Carter himself. The name hit Miss Calloway like a cold wave, sending a sharp realization down her spine. Elias Carter, the man who owned the airline, whose child she had just shugged. Her mouth felt dry as she tried again, lowering her voice. I was just doing my job. Mara let out a soft breath of disbelief. Your job? You shoved a child? Calloway, you physically handled a. I was keeping order in first class, Miss Calloway snapped. Maya's face darkened. No, you were making an assumption, and now you're paying for it, she said firmly. Miss Calloway's breath caught, but she quickly forced her features into an impassive mask. She had dealt with difficult passengers, entitled executives, and high-pressure situations before she could fix this one. She just needed to stay calm as she looked toward the cockpit, her mind already racing with possible solutions. Defenses. Maybe if she talked to the captain, she could get him to calm down. Maybe she could say Zen was exaggerating. The soft chime of the in-flight phone interrupted her thoughts. Genius answered it, and this time his eyes widened a little as he spoke, and his voice was noticeably more tense. Yes, sir, I'll tell her right away, he said. He then hung up and looked directly at Miss Calloway, telling her she had to stay seated for the rest of the flight and not talk to any other passengers, including Zen. Miss Calloway's lips parted a little. Excuse me, she said. Headquarters has made their decision. You're not just being escorted off the plane, Calloway, you're being suspended. The words hit her like a slap in the face, and Myra's eyes flickered with something that couldn't be read: disbelief, pity, and shock. Even she hadn't expected the punishment to come this quickly. They can't just, Miss Calloway said, her stomach twisting. It's done, Jonas cut her off, it's done. Miss Calloway clenched her teeth and asked, what am I supposed to do until we land? Jonas pointed to an empty cruise seat in the galley. Miss Calloway's skin pricked with shame. She was a senior flight attendant who was told to sit like a passenger in trouble, and people were still looking at her funny. She knew that by the time the plane landed, the whole crew and maybe even other airlines would be talking about it. This wasn't just a suspension. Miss Calloway clenched her teeth and walked stiffly toward the galley. She sat down with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She had always been the one giving orders, but now she was being put in her place. Zen sat quietly in his seat, sipping his juice. His little fingers were still curled around his stuffed airplane. His tablet vibrated again with a new message: Daddy, sit tight. I'll be at the gate when you land. Zane didn't answer, but a small knowing smile tugged at his shoulder. At the corner of his lips, Miss Calloway thought the punishment was over. She had no idea that this was just the start. The plane kept flying, but the mood inside the cabin had changed completely. People who had been focused on their meals and entertainment were now exchanging quiet glances and murmuring. The tension that had been in first class had turned into a heavier sense of anticipation for what would happen next. Miss Calloway sat stiffly in the cruise seat in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the seat in front of her. It hurt her fingers to wear her uniform skirt so tight. She had never felt so helpless in her whole career. An hour ago, she had walked through this cabin with authority, making sure people followed her rules. Now, she was just a passenger waiting for judgment. The soft chime of the intercom broke the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. Flight attendant, please secure the cabin. Miss Calloway's stomach churned. This is it across the... Merrick carefully went down the aisle, checking people's seat belts and making sure everything was in order. When she got to Zen's seat, she stopped. He was still holding on to his stuffed airplane, but his body wasn't tense like it had been before. He looked calm, almost like he knew what was going to happen next. Mara knelt down and lowered her voice so only Zen could hear her. Okay, Zen said, tapping his fingers gently on the tablet in his lap. My dad will be there when we land, he said softly. She wasn't sure what to say, but she gave him a small nod and told him, good job. She then said, you deserve that. As she walked away, she stole a look at Miss Calloway. The woman's face was blank, but Merrick could tell she was scared because her shoulders were stiff and her jaw was locked. As the plane got closer to the airport, the city lights came on. As the landing gear came out, the engines roared softly, and Mara moved back to her seat and buckled up as the final approach began. As soon as the plane touched down, everything changed. Passengers grabbed their phones right away, and the familiar chimes of messages being received filled the air. Some stretched, while others shifted impatiently, wanting to get off the plane. But Miss Calloway barely moved because at the front of the plane, just beyond the jet bridge window, 2 security officers were already there. Mara followed her gaze, slightly widening her own eyes to show that they hadn't wasted any time. Jonas came up from the galley and cleared his throat. He said quietly to Miss Calloway, you're to remain seated until all the passengers have exited, and then you'll be escorted off the aircraft. Miss Calloway turned sharply, her voice lower but laced with frustration. You'll be escorted where Jonas didn't blink to the executive office. Elias Carter wants a formal me-in, Carter said. First-class passengers were some of the first to get off the plane. As Zen unbuckled his seat belt and reached for his stuffed airplane and tablet before carefully climbing down, Miss Calloway watched him. He didn't rush or look nervous, he just walked to the front of the plane, where his father was already waiting. As soon as Zen stepped off the plane, Elias Carter was there, wearing a tailored black suit and crossing his arms over his chest. He was a man who rarely had to raise his voice. People walking by stole glances at him, and some recognized him right away. Zen looked up at his father and said, "Hi, Daddy." Elias let out a sigh, and he knelt down to Zen's level. He put a warm hand on Zen's shoulder and asked him, "Are you okay?" Zen replied, "Yes, I am." Elias's face turned a little darker as he looked toward the jet bridge at the woman who still hadn't gotten off the plane. Miss Calloway could feel his gaze from inside the plane. She swallowed hard and forced herself to sit still, her hands shaking a little. She had to face the most powerful man in the airline industry and answer for what she had done. Row by row, people got off the plane, rolling their bags down the aisle and stretching their stiff muscles as they did so. But Miss Calloway was the only one who moved slowly. She stayed seated in the crew chair, her back straight, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could hear the footsteps, the murmurs, and the people who had seen everything weren't interested anymore. They knew what was going on. She was being left behind. Mara unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, and took one last look at Miss Calloway. It was a moment Mara never thought she'd see. The once untouchable senior flight attendant, who was always so firm and sure of herself, was now just another worker waiting for judgment. Jonas, who was always so professional, finally stepped forward, and it was time for Miss Calloway to take a sharp breath. As she rose from her seat and smoothed down her uniform, she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The tightness in her chest got worse with each step toward the exit. She wasn't walking off the plane as a member of the crew, she was walking off like a criminal being processed. As soon as she stepped onto the jet bridge, her heart stopped. Standing right there, just past the open door, was Elias Carter. Two uniformed security officers stood on either side of him, but he didn't need them because his presence was enough to command the. Some people pretended to check their phones, but everyone was listening. The news quickly spread through the airport that something big was happening on Flight 237. Elias didn't say anything at first, he just looked at her. Miss Calloway couldn't hold his gaze for more than a second, her throat felt dry, and her hands twitched slightly at her sides. She wanted to speak first to explain and take control of the conversation before it went off the rails, but she couldn't. As soon as she parted her lips, Elias tilted his head slightly and his heavy gaze silenced her. "Follow me," he said in a low, unreadable voice, and Miss Calloway did as she was told. She didn't dare look back at the crowd in the terminal because she knew what she'd see: people whispering, employees staring, and the rumor spreading faster than she could stop it. She followed Elias through a private set of doors and out of sight of everyone else. The walls of the executive corridor were sleek and lined with dark wood. She had never been to an executive meeting like this before, and she knew that wasn't a good thing. The door to the executive office shut softly behind her, and the conference room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. The table was long and shiny, and there were leather chairs around it that looked much more expensive than anything Miss Calloway had ever sat in. Elias Carter took the seat at the head of the table, crossing one leg over the other as he did so. He carefully adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket and moved slowly and deliberately. Miss Calloway sat across from him with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her heart was pounding. The door opened again, and a woman in a tailored navy blue suit walked in. She carried a tablet, and her cool, analytical gaze was on Leona Carter Elias, Leona's wife. Miss Calloway's stomach hurt because she had only met Leona once, at a business event years ago, but she knew that the woman was. She was smart, experienced, and had just as much power in the company as her husband. Leona sat down next to Elias and put her tablet down on the table without saying a word. The door opened one last time, and Zane walked in. Miss Calloway felt her whole body tense. He was still holding his stuffed airplane, but he didn't look small anymore. He looked steady, standing between his parents with his head held high. Leona broke the silence by asking, "You know why we're here?" Miss Calloway forced a tight nod. Elias leaned forward and smiled. Calloway swallowed hard and said, I understand that I was called here because of a problem with a passenger. Leona raised an eyebrow and said, a problem? Elias's voice was emotionless and flat. You put your hands on my child. Calloway's breath caught in her throat. Leona adjusted her glasses and said, let's be very clear about what happened. Her voice was calm but dangerously sharp. You didn't just remove a passenger from first class, you singled out a disabled child, you assumed he didn't belong, and then when he struggled to sit down. As she tried to explain herself, Ellis cut her off with a cold look and said, I don't care what you meant. The room went silent, and Miss Calloway realized for the first time that she wasn't there to defend herself, she was here to listen, and she wasn't in charge. Zen leaned forward a little and spoke in a soft but firm voice, would you have pushed me if I looked different? Miss Calloway's throat tightened, and she didn't answer. She knew the truth deep down, and now everyone else did too. Miss Calloway's throat was tight, and her hands were clenched together so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. The executive office was dead quiet, and it wasn't about airline rules or customer service procedures, it was about the truth, and it was staring her in the face. Zen stood there, silent but steady, waiting for an answer. He wasn't crying or raising his voice, he was just watching her. That was much worse. Leota folded her hands neatly on the table and said, well, answer him. Miss Calloway's lips parted, but no words came out because there was no good answer. No matter what she said, the truth was that she had judged Zen as soon as she saw him. She thought she had reacted by touching a child who didn't deserve it, and now she had to face that truth. Alas, he exhaled slowly, his sound measured and deliberate. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table. Miss Calloway swallowed and said, I've worked for this airline for 12 years, and Ilis nodded. Yet somehow you still thought it was okay to shove a child in his seat. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. Miss Calloway's heart raced as she said, it wasn't I didn't mean. Elias lifted a hand to silence her instantly. You thought he didn't belong in first classy. Others had whispered the same thing. She felt like the walls were closing in on her when Elias tilted his head slightly and said, you're not going to admit it. Miss Calloway's breath was shaking as she said, I made a mistake. Leona adjusted her glasses, her face blank. Mistake is dropping a passenger's drink, she said calmly. Mistake is misplacing a meal order. She leaned forward a little, her eyes like blades cutting through the air. You put your hands on our son. Sal's voice became harsh. His fingers tightened a little around his stuffed airplane, but his voice stayed steady. You thought I didn't belong here, he said again, this time softer. Because I don't look like the other passengers. Miss Calloway's stomach twisted painfully. It would have been easier if he had yelled at her, screamed, or thrown a fit, but he wasn't doing any of those things. He was calm, and that made it so much worse. Elias sighed and shook his head slightly. I've dealt with people like you before, Miss Calloway, he said. Because they wear a uniform and have some power, they get to decide who belongs and who doesn't. He let the words sink in before continuing, you don't get to decide that you never did. Miss Calloway's chest felt tight, and she could feel herself breaking down inside piece by piece, but she wouldn't let it show. Leota looked at Elias and tapped a few things on her tablet before turning the screen so it faced Miss Calloway. Your employment contract, she said, sliding the screen across the table so it was facing her. Effective immediately you are. Terminated from Sky Airlines, those words hit Miss Calloway like a punch. Her breath caught in her throat, and her voice cracked a little, but she quickly cleared it. I understand a suspension, but I've worked here for 12 years, she said. Did you ever stop to think about how many other passengers you judged unfairly in those 12 years? Elias asked. Miss Calloway froze because she knew the answer. She had done this before, maybe not exactly like this, not with a child, not in a situation this year, she said. She had spent years judging passengers instantly to see who was worthy of respect and who wasn't, and now it had finally caught up with her. Leona's voice stayed cold. Your final paycheck will be processed within the week. You will also receive a letter barring you from employment within any subsidiary airline under the Sky brand. Miss Calloway's stomach churned violently. She knew how the airline industry worked. Word of this would spread, and other companies would hear about it. Her name would be talked about in the HR office, and her record would be ruined forever. She had spent years working her way up, earning respect, and in the span of one flight, she had lost it all. Her face was pale, and her fingers were curled tightly into her lap. "Mr. Carter," she begged, "please make your voice quieter. I know I made a mistake." Elias's eyes hardened. "Would you have given my son a second chance if the roles were reversed?" Miss Calloway stopped. Elias leaned forward and asked. Lowering her voice a little, Calloway couldn't answer because the truth was she wouldn't have given Zen a second thought. She would have gone on with her day sure she had done the right thing. She would never have apologized, and now she was paying the price for it. Leona looked at Zen and then back at her husband. "There's nothing else to talk about." Elias nodded. He didn't need to say anything else. The decision was final. A security officer stepped in and Miss Calloway's heart raced as she realized she was being led away. She wanted to fight back in protest, asking for one more chance, but she knew there wasn't one. She stood there, not looking at Elias, Leona, or Zen. Instead, she walked toward the door, her legs heavy, her chest tight, and her career over. As she stepped outside, she heard one last thing, Zen's quiet voice, not mean or triumphant, just honest. "Now you know what it feels like to be told you don't belong." As the door shut behind her, Miss Calloway stepped out of the conference room, her head spinning. As soon as the door closed behind her, the weight of everything fell on her shoulders. She didn't know where to go or what to do. Two security officers stood on either side of her, waiting for her to start walking. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic removal, and no raised voices, but the way they stood next to her made it clear she was no longer welcome here. As she walked forward, her shoes softly clicked against the sleek marble floors. Each step felt heavier than the last 12 years of service. She had promised herself that she wouldn't cry, she wouldn't break, and she would keep her pride intact no matter what. But as she walked through the private hallways of the airline headquarters, knowing she would never step foot here again, she felt something inside her break. She had lost something and there was no way to get it back. Her mind was racing with scary thoughts. Would she ever work for another airline again? Would the whispers follow her everywhere she went? Would people hear her name and remember this flight, this mistake, this moment that ended her career? She had never stopped to think about how many other people she had treated unfairly over the years, how many passengers she had looked down on, dismissed, or made feel like they didn't belong. It had been so easy, and now she was on. She was the one being talked about in the hallways, being judged, and being taken away, and she hated every second of it. The officer stopped at a private employee exit that led straight to the parking lot. Miss Calloway took a slow, shaky breath and asked, "Am I free to go?" One of the officers replied, "You're not under arrest, but we do recommend you leave quietly." Miss Calloway nodded stiffly and pushed open the door, stepping outside into the afternoon sun. She blinked hard to adjust to the bright light, but she had only taken 2 steps into the parking lot before she stopped. There, waiting near the black town car parked by the curb, was a reflection of Mara. She had thought that Mara would still be inside finishing up her work and moving on with her day, but she was standing there with her arms crossed and an expression that she couldn't read. Miss Calloway forced herself to stand taller to gather herself. She tried to keep her voice low and asked, "What do you want?" Even Maya didn't flinch. "I wanted to see what it looks like when someone like you actually faces consequences," Miss Calloway said. "I made a mistake," she said, even though the words didn't feel hollow to her. Maya shook her head slowly and said, "You made a choice." Miss Calloway had always thought of herself as someone who followed rules and kept things in order. She had never thought that maybe she had been using the rules to justify her own preferences. She thought she was protecting first class, but instead she was choosing who should be there, and now she was outside of an airline she would never work for again. Mira looked at her for a long time before sighing. "When I first started working with you, I thought you were the kind of person who never made mistakes and always knew what was best." Miss Calloway's throat felt tight, and Mira let out a sigh. "I just feel sorry for you." Miss Calloway's stomach dropped. She was expecting anger, bitterness, or even satisfaction, but what she got was pity, which was so much worse. Mara didn't wait for a response. She shook her head one last time and turned to go back inside, the door clicking shut behind her. Miss Calloway was left alone. She had come into the day thinking she was the one who decided who belonged where, but in the end she wasn't supposed to be anywhere. She stood still in the parking lot, the warm breeze barely registering on her. The soft hum of distant airport traffic filled the air, but it was nothing compared to the noise in her head. She was fired from the job she had loved for more than 10 years, the authority she wore like armor, and the reputation she had built. It was all gone, and she would never be able to get it back. She had told herself for years that she was just following rules and keeping order, but deep down she knew she had never really. She thought everyone should be in first class, but now she was the one who had been turned away. She swallowed hard and forced her feet to move as she walked across the parking lot to her car. Each step felt heavier, like she was carrying the weight of every moment that had led to this, every passenger she had ignored, every quiet judgment she had passed, and every time she thought she knew someone just by looking at them. When she got to her car, she grabbed the door handle with cold fingers for the first time. For the first time in years, she had nowhere to go, no one to answer to, and nothing to hold her accountable. Her fingers shook a little as she opened the door and sank into the driver's seat. She sat there for a long time, staring at the dashboard with shallow breathing. She could still see how Elias Carter had looked at her and how Leona Carter had spoken with that deadly calm. Worst of all, she could still hear Zen's voice saying, "Now you know what it feels like to be told you don't belong." This made her shiver. She lost her job, but the real punishment wasn't that. It was having to see herself the way other people had seen her for the first time in years. For years, she hadn't paid attention to the uncomfortable looks, hesitant words, and frustrated looks in the eyes of the people she had quietly ruled over. She had never really thought she was wrong until now. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as a sharp pain settled in her chest. This wasn't just one flight, she had been this way for years. Suddenly, it hit her like a tsunami. If Zen weren't the son of the airline owner, she wouldn't have been punished at all. She would have just walked away thinking she was right. The thought made her sick to her stomach because if she was wrong about this, if she was blind to something so obvious, then how many other people were out there? How many powerful people were making decisions every day that were just like hers? She took a sharp breath in and blinking back an unfamiliar sting behind her eyes. Regret was there, a strange and unwanted presence. She had spent 12 years building her career, reputation, and authority, but she had never stopped to ask herself one simple question: had she ever really been fair? She let out a shaky breath and gripped the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white for the first time. She didn't know the answer, and maybe that was the worst part of all. At the airport terminal, Zen sat comfortably in one of the private lounges, swinging his feet slightly as he sipped his juice. The tension from earlier had got away and been replaced with a quiet sense of relief. His father sat next to him, looking at his watch before turning to his son and saying, "You okay?" Zen nodded and adjusted the stuffed airplane he was holding. "Yeah," Leona said. She watched them both with an expression that couldn't be read before she spoke. When she walked out, she looked shaken. Elias hummed and adjusted the cuff of his suit. "Good she needed to be," Leona said. "Do you think she learned?" Ellis was quiet for a moment as he thought about the question, and then he finally let out a sigh of relief. "That's not up to me." Zen looked up at his father, and El met his son's gaze. At the end of the day, no amount of punishment, firing, or loss of reputation could make someone change. They had to choose to change. Zen thought about what his father said, and then slowly nodded. He wasn't sure if Miss Calloway would ever really understand what had happened today, but he knew for sure she would never forget it, and sometimes that was the. As he stood up, Elias lightly ruffled his son's hair and said, "Let's go home." Zen smiled, picked up his tablet and stuffed airplane, and slid off the seat. He reached for his father's hand and grabbed it firmly as they walked toward the exit. And just like that, the boy who had been told he didn't belong walked out of the airport knowing he did. If you liked this story, Please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. Watch more videos like this one.